For the first time in a long time, SWORDSOUL Tinny has lost its place on the tier list. Now, is that entirely fair? So I picked up the deck, we went back into rank just to see how it competes with the brand new cards, to see if there is actually a situation where it has dropped off competitively. And I'm gonna be honest, I really don't think that that's the case. I'm starting to think that people maybe are just moving away from the deck because it has been out literally forever. For well over a year and a half now, and it has been top tier ever since its release, finally falling off, and it could literally just be a case of people just don't want to play it. There's still a lot of people hitting top cut finishes using this deck, and even in my own experience, it's still very, very powerful, so I'm not entirely sure why it's dropped off. I do expect it to see at least some level of resurgence. It'll likely be popping onto and off of tier 3 over the next little while, but this deck is definitely not weak. I do think that this is still the best way to play SWORDSOUL. I have played around with the new cash cards in SWORDSOUL a little bit. I've played around obviously with the previous versions. I've played the Bestial version. I haven't played Branded yet, which I do plan on doing, but I don't see it being as good as Pure. And honestly, I'm super impressed. So we're going to be doing a deck profile at the end of the video, card for card, just for anybody who maybe hasn't seen the deck before, for newer players perhaps, as well as showing off a few games, talking about some of the plays, some of the cards, some of the combos, just so that we all have an idea of exactly where it is we're meant to be going with it. So if you're interested in this style of thing, you can absolutely subscribe to catch things as it's coming out every single day, and like this if you enjoy watching it. But I'm not going to waste too much of your time here at the start. Let's get straight into it. Alright, getting into game 1 here, we're playing just through the standard SWORDSOUL Tinny lanes. We're also playing Triple Tactics Thrust in this version of it, taking advantage of one of the new staple cards. This card is honestly amazing. So we're going to start off standard Mo Yi lanes. We use Emergent Search for Mo Yi. Summon Mo Yi, get out the token, going in the Grandmaster. Anyone who's even remotely familiar with SWORDSOUL knows that these plays off by heart. They are your bread and butter. So we get the draw one off the Mo Yi here. Now we get the search off of the Shizao, grabbing the Strategist as per usual. We're going to use Strategist, dropping the Vishuda, summoning itself as well as a token, going into Baron de Fleur. So that is pretty much your standard end board, 1200 points of damage, set 2, and pass. So this is decent enough. So the thing about SWORDSOUL, right, and this is sort of what kept it relevant for so long, is that it doesn't put up this crazy end board of like 8 interruptions or floodgates or anything like that. But what it does is it sets up enough interruption on a consistent enough basis to where it's usually it's netting you more wins over a longer period of time through consistent play, right? It's not a crazy end board, but it is super consistent, and it also has a lot of room for flex spots and hand traps, interruptions, things like that. So SWORDSOUL is more than just its end board, and the end board's still decent, right? You still got a couple of interruptions, and you still have a lot of follow-up and things, but there's more to it than just its end board, right? So our opponent unfortunately just set 5 pass, right? Setting 4 back row, setting a monster face down and passing, so God knows what the hell they're playing. We're going to go main phase 1 using Baron to pop one of the back row. Turns out to be Big Welcome Labyrinth, so we're playing against Lab. Then they're going to flip up Destructive Daruma Cannon, so we have to negate that off Baron de Fleur, otherwise we're beat, right? Then they also flip up There Can Only Be One, so this guy's playing Floodgates like hell. So There Can Only Be One does now take effect. That means we can only control 1 monster of each typing. Luckily, our 2 monsters are different types, so that's not too big of a deal, but it does prevent us from playing more. They're going to summon out the lovely Labyrinth, bouncing their face down monster back to the hand. That's going to trigger off the Lady Labyrinth to try and pop a card. We are going to use the Shizao to negate that, so that they don't end up popping one of our cards. We kind of don't really have a lot to spare, but now our Triple Tactics Thrust is live. We're going to activate Thrust. They're going to go for Max C now for some reason. I decided to just let that go because we're not going to special summon anything, so I'm not even going to use Cross out here. We're going to go for Triple Tactics Talent. They're going to chain the Eradicator Epidemic Virus and call Trap card, so we don't actually even get to steal their monster. They get to pop the Infinite Impermanence in our hand, and unfortunately our tactics then fizzles, but they're left with absolutely 0 plays left. And we basically just win the game because of that. They used all of their resources and weren't able to break the board. They weren't actually able to deal with any of our cards. They only dealt with, what, tactics, I guess? So, there you go. Playing through Labyrinth, playing through Floodgates, pretty easy stuff in the game 2. Okay, so in game 2 here, I just want to very quickly talk through what this hand is capable of here. So this hand is full combo. You have to do it slightly differently though. What you would do is you would basically use your strategist. You would drop the Ashuna off of your strategist, summon itself in a token. You would use Ashuna then to bring out a Tinny from deck to go into your Grandmaster using your Sword Soul strategist original token, and then you would sort of play your combo from there a little bit. So this hand is unironically full combo. We start by summoning out the Vishida to put the monster on board, but they go for Max C, right? And one of the biggest weaknesses of this deck is that you don't really have any plays through Max C. Like, literally, unless you open Blackout, unless you do something crazy, or you have a negate for it, the deck really doesn't play through Max C very well. Even playing alternative interruptions for Max C, the likes of Gamma or Duel, kind of really hurt you as well. Because by the time you're going to go for Duel, after your draws and your searches, your opponent's already drew a handful of cards. The Gamma doesn't really work because most of the time they're going to be activating Max C after you've normal summoned one of your Sword Souls. So it's not fantastic. It doesn't have a ton of outs to Max C. You literally just have to hope you draw one of the 6 counters, which is a decent enough number of counters to it. You have 6, right? It's not as if there's none, but it is definitely a major weakness of the deck. So we're just going to set in permanent pass. There's no point in going crazy here. We do have a Max C of our own at the very least. They're going to go for Interrupted Kaiju Slumber. We're going to go Max C and chain to that just to see if we can get some cards, or at the very least dissuade our opponent from playing. We don't really even need to draw anything. All we need to do is basically make our opponent not want to play. They're going to go for the Water Dance here. Looks like we're playing against Mikanko. Luckily, we do have that Imperm from earlier. Imperm being able to shut down the Hare is a pretty big choke point when it comes to Mikanko if you don't have a very good hand, and luckily for us, our opponent did not. So all they really had was the Interrupted Kaiju Slumber and their Hare. So we've got the Kaiju on board. We're going to go for the Moyi now, revealing the Ashuna, summoning a token. We're going to use Vishida now to bounce their monster back to their hand, getting rid of their Wall of Interruption. Now we're going to go into the Shizao. Again, and you're just back to your bread and butter here. We're going to go for the Moyi, draw 1 as chain 2, and then chain 1 our Shizao gets searching. But we've basically got everything we want, so we're actually able to go for the Blackout here. But we're in a position where we can very easily put more than enough on board for lethal. But there's the Nibiru. That's why our opponent was happy enough to wait on us playing. They had the Nibiru ready to go, and they were able to shut down our board here. We do manage to go for Ashuna. Regardless of that, summoning out Adara from the deck, we're going to go Monk of the Tenyi here, activating Adara, banishing it from the graveyard to add Ashuna back to hand. So we're playing through the Nibiru here. Ashuna then summoning itself out to the field. We're going to use Emergence, grabbing Sword Soul of Taya. We're going to use these two, go into Shaman of the Tenyi here, Shaman of the Tenyi, dropping Lightning Storm to go for the Monk. Now, I was originally planning, and the reason we grabbed Taya and ended up not using it, my original plan was to drop Taya off of the Shaman and then basically resummon the Taya from the graveyard to go into a level 8 synchro. But I didn't really like many of the options that we had for level 8 synchros. The only one that was actually any good would have been the likes of Boxia. But I feel like keeping this for the follow-up as well as Blackout with the Monk and everything just put us in a much stronger position. So in hindsight, we should definitely have used Emergence to search for Protoss, 100%. But I did have a plan, and then once we went to execute it, I sort of veered away and changed courses. So, you know, poor planning for myself. I should really have been more aware of that, but that's totally fine. We're able to swing with Monk, Shaman pops the Nibiru, swing directly for 1,000 and 1,600, set 2 and pass. So we're in a position where we got a lot of follow-up here with the Shaman if we still have it, with Taya if we need to. We have the call by, we have the Blackout, we have a Monk here, and we have a 7,300 attack point token. End of the battle phase though, our opponent has evenly matched. They have every possible out, damn. But they do have a big enough hand, right? I'm not overly surprised that they have something like this. They are going to go for the Gathering. They're going to summon out a couple of their Mikankos. They're going too fast for me to keep up. Hita then going to steal the Long One from our graveyard, going into Donner. Donner then using its effect, destroying itself and the Nibiru token, which is very interesting. Instead of just using the likes of the Kaiju to get rid of it, I think going through the Donner route. I guess if they use the Kaiju route, I still have a Kaiju, which I guess they didn't want me to have any monsters on the field. You know, that's fair enough, I guess. But we do have the Taya here, Taya banishing emergence from graveyard, summoning out a token, and our opponent doesn't even want to see the combo that we go into as a result of that, and they scoop it up. So, a hard fought win for sure. Our opponent hitting us with Evenly Matched, with Nibiru, with Interrupted Kaiju Slumber, all of these crazy cards, summoning out their Mikankos like crazy, and we were still able to beat them. So, it is what it is. It was just a hard fought victory. Let's get into game 3. Alright, into the third and final game here, going second, playing against Branded of all things. Branded Despia is a pretty powerful deck. I believe Branded has actually retained its spot on the tier list. Once upon a time, I definitely would have equated these two decks to one another. I would have thought SWORDSOUL and Branded were very much sort of head-to-head. There was one stage in the game where these two were the two best decks in the game, so it's interesting to see them going back head-to-head in the modern age, but luckily for us, an Imperm is able to shut down Aliber, as it often is. We are going to go for Ecclesia here. They're going to hit that with an Ash Blossom. We are going to use Call by the Grave to try and protect the resolution of the Ecclesia, because we really want that Moyi, right? That's pretty important. So we negate the Ash Blossom, sorry, that would have negated our Ecclesia. So Ecclesia still resolves to summon Moyi from deck. Moyi then going to reveal the Ashuna in hand, summoning out a token. Our opponent's going to use Super Polymerization to fuse our two monsters into Garura, Wings of Resonant Life. So he had the Super Poly face down. God damn, Super Poly is an interesting choice in this meta. We're going to need to try and make something work here. We're going to go into Ashuna, then the Monk, and now he's going to hit Ashuna with the Bestial Magnomet, an expertly timed Magnomet that are getting rid of the Ashuna. That puts us in a very awkward situation right here. We had a backup plan where we would have used Ashuna in the graveyard to banish it, to special summon out a Vishuda, normal summon the Ecclesia, and go into the Psychic End Punisher, so we would have at least had something. But our opponent played around us perfectly. Very well played to them. Going into their turn now, they grab the Bestial Lobelion from their deck for follow-up. They draw one, of course, for turn. Going for the Bestial Lobelion, dropping into the graveyard, going to search their deck for Saronir. Saronir then going to activate. They're going to banish the Ecclesia from our graveyard to summon itself out of the field, tributing it off for the Bestial Lobelion here. Looking at the amount of damage they have on board, it's going to be very hard for us to survive this turn. They're going to send Branded Regain to the graveyard. We are going to use Infinite Impermanence here. We are going to negate the Bestial Lobelion, stopping it from setting up the Branded opening, which would have normally basically popped our monster, but even then, it's still not going to be enough to prevent lethal damage, because when Garura inflicts battle damage via direct attack, the damage it inflicts is doubled. So that's 3k right there, and because of that effect, that is lethal. Very well played from our opponent there. They tamed their Bestial's plays perfectly. They had the out in the Super Poly, and yeah, it's just as simple as that. They simply had the cards they needed, and they played them well. Can't complain about that. Branded still sticking around. And Branded is one of those older decks as well, just like SWORDSOUL, that were on the tier list and have been on the tier list for a very, very long time. I do believe Branded Despia is still on the tier list, although I could be wrong on that. I will check it before the deck profile. Speaking of which, let's dive in. Alright, so here is the deck profile. Oh, wait, hang on. I should probably check to make sure my audio is working.
Yo!
Yeah, okay, it's on. Alright, so here is the deck profile. Now, what have we actually changed, mainly coming from our previous SWORDSOUL videos? One of the biggest ones was the inclusion of the brand new Triple Tactics Thrust. This card is a pretty big deal for SWORDSOUL, actually. It really assists in one of its biggest weaknesses in trying to go second. Now, SWORDSOUL Tenyu, once upon a time in its heyday, was revered as the best deck in the game because at the time it was very, very good at going both first and second. Since then, the level of power in the game has since increased to the point where it's not really that good going second, right? It's pretty weak going second. Even going first, it doesn't set up the craziest boards in the world. But its consistency and its power is what keeps it relevant. And that is, unfortunately, apparently by the tier list standards, not enough to keep it relevant. But again, it's more than powerful enough to see you through to the highest levels on the ladder. And I dare say it is going to be finding its way back onto and off of the tier list for the next little while. But let's talk about it. So the flex spots, first of all, just so we can cut these down and we know exactly what it is we're looking at. We have the double effect feeler. We have triple Maxi, triple Ash Blossom. We have Lightning Storm and triple Tactics Talent, just as thrust targets. We of course have the double thrust itself. We have double call by, a single crossout designator, and double infinite impermanence. Now, I would also classify the Heavenly Dragon Circle as a flex spot as well. I really wasn't the biggest fan of this card right now. I'm not sure if this is too relevant to the types of interruption that we're seeing in this meta. So I would maybe cut this as well. Either that or I would play it at 2, right? I don't think playing it at 1 is very smart. I was just sort of still testing it out. I would either cut it or I would play it at 2. I wouldn't play it at 1. But I'm going to count it as flex anyway. You can put it in if you want to, but it's not core. So this is the actual core of the deck. You'll see it's only 22 cards. Very, very small core because the deck is very consistent in what it does. And the amount of space that you have for flex spots is what makes SWORDSOUL so modular and so powerful, right? Because if you're the type of person who prefers to play board breakers, you've got more than enough room. You can play your full anti-maxi package, and then you can play evenly matched, right? You can play Lightning Storm, Tactics, Thrust. If you prefer going first, you've got Veiler, you've got Duel, you've got Ghost Spell, you've got all of these other additional cards that you could play instead. So one of the big points of power of the deck is how much room you have to play all of these additional cards, because it only has a 22 engine core. So let's talk about it. We're going to break it down into 2 main segments, SWORDSOUL and Tenyu. So we'll talk about SWORDSOUL first of all. We have triple Moyi, double Taya, triple Ecclesia, double Strategist here. Then we've got the triple Emergence and the 1 Blackout. So what does SWORDSOUL actually do? Well, it's centered around 3 main deck monsters. You've got Moyi, Taya, and the Strategist. And what they all do is basically under different conditions, they summon out a SWORDSOUL token. A SWORDSOUL token is a level 4 tuner token. Now, they do it under different conditions. Moyi, on summon, will reveal a Worm or SWORDSOUL card in hand to summon its token. Taya will, while on the field, banish a Worm or SWORDSOUL card from the graveyard to summon its token. And the Strategist will reveal itself in hand, discard a Worm or SWORDSOUL card, then summon itself and a token. So that's the idea. They summon themselves and the token, and then you use your SWORDSOUL monster and that token to synchro summon into whatever level monster it is you have access to. And they all also have effects that activate when they're used as synchro material. Moyi will let you draw one. Taya will allow you to send a worm from deck to graveyard. And then your Strategist will inflict 1200 points of damage to your opponent. So they all summon tokens that enable like 1 card synchros, and they all also have additional effects that activate on a successful synchro summon. Very good. We have the incredible Ecclesia, the Virtuous, which can special summon itself from your hand if your opponent controls more monsters than you, and it can basically quick play tribute itself to summon any SWORDSOUL monster from deck. So essentially, Ecclesia is just 3 more copies of either Moyi or Taya. It gives you access to whatever one you need, and it's also a very useful tool for going second since it can special summon itself for free. So you're no longer trapped in a position. One of the biggest weaknesses of this deck is that if you don't have the out, or if you don't have any backup cards, if you normal summon your Moyi and it gets negated, that can be pretty bad. Whereas your Ecclesia, at the very least, if you're going second, removes that vulnerability because you can utilize another of your SWORDSOUL monsters without worrying too much about the negates. So Ecclesia is very, very strong. Then we've got Emergence. Emergence then will search your deck for any SWORDSOUL monster, or if you control a synchro monster, it can add any worm monster from your deck to your hand, so that is pretty awesome for searching for the likes of Protoss if you have already got set up, or it can act just as additional starters like you saw in the gameplay through things like your Moyi. Protoss right now, Protoss is traditionally one of the things that makes SWORDSOUL relevant, right? So Protoss being able to shut down an entire attribute for 2 turns is pretty insane, and SWORDSOUL having easy access to this card is part of what made SWORDSOUL so good for such a long period of time. Right now though, with Kashtira running rampant in the meta, we're in a position where Protoss isn't quite as powerful right now as it has been, since all the Kashtira monsters are all different attributes, right? And they don't really play dark very much. So Protoss isn't all that good right now, and that's a big part of why SWORDSOUL itself as a whole isn't that good right now, because Protoss is a large part of what makes it top tier. And then we got Blackout. Blackout, you can target a worm monster you control and 2 cards your opponent controls, destroy them all. If this card ends up getting banished as well, you can summon a SWORDSOUL token out to the field. Now that is relevant because there are some plays you can do with your Grandmaster or with your Taya that makes that relevant, and you can sort of play through additional interruption using that effect. It does actually come up sometimes. So that's SWORDSOUL monsters. They're really not that complicated. They're all very, very straightforward. And the Tenyi monsters are arguably even more straightforward. So we're playing double Adara, a single Shifana, double Vishuda, and double Ashina. So for a start, all of them, all 4, they can special summon themselves from your hand out of the field if you don't control any effect monsters. Now, your tokens are non-effect monsters, and your monk is a non-effect monster, so you can control those just fine, but you can't control any effect monsters. So they're basically all free special summons, which is nice. Adara is the only tuner in the group, but that's honestly a good thing, because these guys being non-tuners is very helpful most of the time. And what do they actually do? Well, apart from summoning themselves for free out of the hand, they also have an additional effect that you can activate if you control a non-effect monster, be it a token or your monk. Adara will banish itself from hand or graveyard to add a banished worm monster back to your hand. Your Vishuda will banish itself to target a monster your opponent controls and bounce it back, or a card your opponent controls and bounce it back to hand. Excellent for playing through floodgates. And Ashuna will banish itself to special summon a Tenyi from deck, but it does lock you into worms for the rest of the turn, so that is worth bearing in mind. I know I said previously in the game we were going to like banish the Ashuna to summon out like a Psychic Game Punisher, and then I realized after I said that no, you can't actually do that. But yeah, so that is the play there. Shifana is the only one that's slightly different. This one isn't an active effect. What happens is whenever a non-effect monster on your field is destroyed, you get to resummon it by banishing Shifana and then destroy a card your opponent controls. And that covers the entire main deck then. So getting into the extra deck, you don't utilize the entire extra deck very often. There are definitely a few flex spots here, but most of the extra deck is pretty core. You've got Yazi here. Yazi, number 1, can't be targeted, which is unironically won games, usually against me rather than for me. But the Yazi here can target a Yangzing monster you control, including itself, as well as any card your opponent controls, to destroy both. And whenever this card is destroyed, you get to special summon any worm directly from your deck in defense. So this card is pretty good in playing through certain bad hands, right? You've got Boxia, which on summon will count the number of different attribute worm monsters you used for its summon and will spin that many cards from your opponent's field back into the deck. So that is pretty great in combination with your Taya, because Taya is wind and your SWORDSOUL token is water. That gives you 2 attributes, so Boxia will spin 2 on summon if you use the Taya for its summon. So that's pretty good. It can also destroy a card you control to resurrect a level 4 monster from your graveyard. That's excellent follow-up. It's great for enabling something like a Taya, like a Moyu, like an Ecclesia. You're able to set these cards back up to go into even more plays. It can also be used alongside Adara, and I'm skipping ahead here slightly. If you bring back the likes of Adara, you can actually utilize Boxia to go into Xiao Feng, Phantom of the Yangzing. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, this card, as long as it's face up, your opponent can't activate monster effects of monsters sharing an attribute with one of the Yangzing monsters used for its summon. Now, because you used Boxia, that's light. That means your opponent cannot activate the effect of light monsters. Unfortunately, that's not super relevant right now. I don't know if there's any top tier decks using light monsters to any serious effect. I guess you could argue Pearly. But it's not exactly game breaking right now, so it is definitely a neat little tool to keep in your pocket. But if you don't have Xiao Feng, at the moment I don't really think it's worth going out of your way for. It's a decent card, don't get me wrong. It's just right now it's in a bit of a rough spot. Then we got Trico, Berserker of the Tenyi here, a 3k beater. Basically, whenever your opponent activates a monster effect, you can banish that monster, which is pretty good. If it destroys an effective monster by battle, it gains that monster's attack points and it can attack again once per turn. So it's a pretty aggressive card. It's usually just a backup target off of your, like if you have the ability to go into a secondary level 8, and sometimes you do, it happens more often than you'd think, Draco is a pretty solid target. If you've already resolved something like Ashuna, locking yourself into Worms. Dragite is usually your preferred option if you haven't locked yourself into Worms already. Because this card, as long as you have a water monster in grave, like the Mo Yi, this card will act as a once per turn spell or trap card negate, and that is pretty powerful. Dragite is awesome. With the Grandmaster, 2 copies of Grandmaster, because this is one of your core cards. On summon, you get to search your deck for a, either add from deck to hand or banish from deck a Sword Soul card. Now, the reason that distinction is relevant is because normally 99% of the time, you're just going to search. Sorry, I'm still recovering from a bit of a cold. You're going to be searching your deck for a card for the likes of Mo Yi, for the likes of Strategist. Well, not Mo Yi, sorry, you'll never search Mo Yi. What you'll be searching for is either Strategist or Emergence. That is it. The reason is Strategist is necessary to go into your next level of play, but if you already have access to it, then Emergence but gets you access to Protos. Both of which are very, very powerful plays. It really does depend on your situation which you go for, but those are typically the 2 cards you would search for. Now, in a pinch, in a really bad situation, you can also banish from the deck Sword Soul Blackout, and that will give you an additional token. So if let's say your Mo Yi was negated, or your Taya was negated, or whatever, and you still had like a Strategist in hand that was live. So with that one level 4 monster on board, you could activate Strategist to discard another card, summon itself in a token. You use the token and your level 4 to go into the Grandmaster, and then Grandmaster banishes Blackout to grab another token for your Strategist to use to go into a level 10 synchro. So that effect does come up. Very niche, but definitely still something worth bearing in mind. Getting into the level 10s here, we actually play a lot of level 10s. Our primary one though is Baron de Fleur, and that comes to the surprise of exactly no one. This card is pretty damn powerful, has been since release. Once while face up, Omni Negate is pretty difficult for many things to contend with, so the Baron de Fleur is very powerful. The main reason we summon this over any of our other targets is purely to stop board breakers, evenly matched, lightning storm, whatever. Baron de Fleur being able to negate those does set it out ahead of the other level 10 targets. And speaking of level 10 targets, Qing Ying is your next one. For every banished card, he gains 100 attack and defense, and your opponent's monsters all lose 100 attack and defense. He can protect himself from destruction by banishing a card from the graveyard, and if a card is banished while he's on the field, you get to actively banish a card from your opponent's field and one from their graveyard without targeting. Pretty strong card. We have the Sinister Sovereign, and then whatever that says, I'm not saying that. That's whenever this card. So if you control this card and you synchro summon another worm, you get to draw one. That's very niche. But its main purpose is that it is 2 interruptions in one. So if your opponent special summons a monster, you get to banish one of those monsters and inflict 1200 points of damage. If your opponent activates a spell or a trap, you get to banish that spell or trap and then inflict 1200 points of damage. And you can do each of those things once per turn. That means it's basically 2 interruptions baked in one. With the amount of decks that are reliant upon field spells or continuous spells or anything like that right now, that spell or trap banish is very, very powerful. So it's basically just a really good value card. You can get a lot out of it. Not only do you get additional draw power on like turn 3, you're also in a position where you're banishing and essentially stopping multiple of your opponent's cards. So it is a good value play, and I would summon this more often if I wasn't as worried about the likes of Evenly Matched or other board breakers, which would push me towards summoning Baron de Fleur. And lastly, the least core of them is the Ice Jade, whatever that says. So the level 10 Ice Jade here. Essentially, so let's read through it together then. So basically, as a quick effect, you can activate this. Face-up monsters you control can't be destroyed or banished by your opponent's card effects. And if you activated it in response to an opponent's card, you banish that card. That's pretty good, right? So it basically banishes a card and then makes your field indestructible for the rest of the turn. That is solid. That's why we're playing it. If a card is banished by your opponent's card effect while this card's in the graveyard, bring it back from the grave. Again, pretty solid card. The only reason we don't summon this card as often as we do other things is because the other options are just so powerful, right? We have Baron de Fleur, the Sinister Sovereign in particular. I wouldn't summon Qing Ying going first unless I had Blackout. I would definitely summon the Ice Jade over Qing Ying going first without Blackout. But yeah, again, with Baron de Fleur and the Sinister Sovereign here, it's often very difficult to justify summoning the Ice Jade. But it is definitely an option. If you maybe don't have this card and you don't want to play it, you're not going to miss it. You can play something else if you want, even if it's just another monk or whatever. But yeah, you're not going to lose sleep over not having that card in your extra deck. Then we got the Psychic End Punisher, which is necessary for its level. If you want to use your Tiny Spirits alongside one of your Sword Soul tokens, you need to have this card. That's pretty much why it's here. We all know its effect. It's a very popular card, but it's mainly here for its level. Then we got Double Monk, non-effect monster. You can summon off of any of your Tenues to keep their effects live. Then you got Shaman. Shaman, discard a card, target a worm in the graveyard, bring it back, but it does lock you into only Tenue effects from the extra deck for the rest of the turn. And if a non-effect monster battles an opponent's card, you can pop a card they control. Pretty straightforward card, excellent for recovery plays, especially alongside a Taya, where you can drop a Taya to summon Taya and do all sorts of crazy things. So the Shaman is definitely a pretty good card. I would recommend playing it. And that's pretty much it. So that is Sword Soul for anyone who is unfamiliar with the deck. Again, it is quite a popular one, but I appreciate when newer players might not have seen too much of it because it hasn't been seeing a ton of play in recent time, and it is a pretty old deck. So if you're newer to the game and you want a more accessible deck, Sword Soul isn't exactly the cheapest thing in the world, but in terms of budget options, you can definitely cut this. You can cut the Punisher, you can cut the Shell Fang right now. Dragate is not core to the deck. Even Berserker isn't really core to the deck, really. It's a really good card, don't get me wrong, but it's not core. You only use it as like a backup level 8 option. But yeah, so this is what I would say you really need. The extra deck is pricey, but a lot of these cards, or at least some of them, you're going to utilize in other contexts as well. But the main deck itself is very affordable. Only 4 URs in the entire main deck. Other than your tech options. But yeah, that's Sword Soul for anyone who's unaware. If you got this far into the video, make sure you're subscribed, like it, because obviously if you watched this far, you must have liked something you were seeing. So you might as well hit like, it doesn't cost you anything. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye.